Good morning. We're here on 7/8/21, back again for approximately 10 minutes a day, reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. Today we're starting Chapter 12, Peter Kropotkin, from The Conquest of Bread, 1892. And then this starts right at page 159. So let's go ahead and give it a read. And here's Michael Malice's introduction. No one has done as much to flesh out what anarcho-communism would look like in practice as Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin regarded anarchism as the evolved alternative to the might makes right social Darwinist worldview, and is quoted as saying, quote, "Competition is the law of the jungle, but cooperation is the law of civilization." He envisioned a peaceful society where everyone would work to the benefit of all, where kindness and compassion motivated humanity. Despite claims that he was utterly naive, it is violence that is by far the exception in interpersonal human interaction. Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread remains the classic text elucidating the ANCOM perspective. So here we go. Anarchist Communism, Part 1. Every society which has abolished private property will be forced, we maintain, to organize itself on the lines of communistic anarchy. Anarchy leads to communism, and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality. Time was when a peasant family could consider the corn which it grew, or the woolen garments woven in the cottage, as the products of its own toil. But even then, this way of looking at things was not quite correct. There were the roads and the bridges made in common, the swamps drained by common toil, and the communal pastures enclosed by hedges, which were kept in repair by each and all. If the looms for weaving or the dyes for coloring fabrics were improved, all profited. So even in those days, a peasant family could not live alone, but was dependent in 1,000 ways on the village or the commune. But nowadays, in the present state of industry, when everything is interdependent, when each branch of production is knit up with all the rest, the attempt to claim an individualist origin for the products of industry is absolutely untenable. The astonishing perfection attained by the textile or mining industries in civilized countries is due to the simultaneous development of 1,000 other industries, great and small, to the extension of the railroad system, to interoceanic navigation, to the manual skill of thousands of workers, to a certain standard of culture reached by the working classes as a whole, to the labors, in short, of men in every corner of the globe. The Italians who died of cholera while making the Suez Canal, or the ankylosis in the St. Gothard Tunnel, and the Americans mowed down by shot and shell while fighting for the abolition of slavery, have helped to develop the cotton industry in France and England, as well as the work girls who languish in the factories of Manchester and Rouen, and the inventor who, following the suggestion of some worker, succeeds in improving the looms. How then shall we estimate the share of each in the riches which all contribute to amass? Looking at production from this general synthetic point of view, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportionate to the hours of labor rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement, or even a step in the right direction, without discussing whether exchange value of goods is really measured in existing societies by the amount of work necessary to produce it, according to the doctrine of Smith and Ricardo, in whose footsteps Marx has followed. Suffice it to say here, leaving ourselves free to return to the subject later, that the collectivist ideal appears to us untenable in a society which considers the instruments of labor as a common inheritance. Starting from this principle, such a society would find itself forced from the very outset to abandon all forms of wages. The mitigated individualism of the collectivist system certainly could not maintain itself alongside a partial communism, the socialization of land and the instruments of production. A new form of property requires a new form of remuneration. A new method of production cannot exist side by side with the old forms of consumption. any more than it can adapt itself to the old forms of political organization. The wage system arises out of the individual ownership of the land and the instruments of labor. It was the necessary condition for the development of capitalist production and will perish with it, in spite of the attempts to disguise it as, quote, profit sharing. The common possession of the instruments of labor must necessarily bring with it the enjoyment in common of the fruits of common labor. We hold further that communism is not only desirable, but that existing societies founded on individualism are inevitably impelled in the direction of communism. The development of individualism during the last 3 centuries is explained by the efforts of the individual to protect himself from the tyranny of capital and of the state. For a time he imagined, and those who expressed his thought for him declared, that he could free himself entirely from the state and from society. Quote, by means of money, he said, I can buy all that I need. But the individual was on the wrong track, and modern history has taught him to recognize that without the help of all, he can do nothing, although his strong boxes are full of gold. In fact, alongside the current of individualism, we find in all modern history a tendency, on the one hand, to retain all that remains of the partial communism of antiquity, and on the other, to establish the communist principle in the 1,000 developments of modern life. As soon as the communes of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries had succeeded in emancipating themselves from their lords, ecclesiastical or lay, their communal labor and communal consumption began to expand and develop rapidly. The township, and not private persons, freighted ships and equipped expeditions, and the benefit arising from the foreign trade did not accrue to individuals but was shared by all. The townships also bought provisions for their citizens. Traces of these institutions have lingered on into the 19th century, and the folk piously cherish the memory of them in their legends. All that has disappeared, but the rural township still struggles to preserve the last traces of this communism. And it succeeds, except when the state throws its heavy sword into the balance. Meanwhile, new organizations, based on the same principle, to every man according to his needs, spring up under 1,000 different forms, for without a certain leaven of communism, the present societies could not exist. In spite of the narrowly egoistic turn given to men's minds by the commercial system, the tendency towards communism is constantly appearing, and influences our activities in a variety of ways. The bridges, for the use of which a toll was levied in the old days, are now become public property and free to all. So are the high roads, except in the East, where a toll is still exacted from the traveler for every mile of his journey. Museums, free libraries, free schools, free meals for children, parks and gardens open to all, streets paved and lighted, free to all, water supplied to every house without measure or stint. All such arrangements are founded on the principle, quote, take what you need. The tramways and railways have already introduced monthly and annual season tickets without limiting the number of journeys taken. And 2 nations, Hungary and Russia, have introduced on their railways the zone system, which permits the holder to travel 500 or 1,000 miles for the same price. It is but a short step from that to a uniform charge, such as already prevails in the postal service. In all these innovations and 1,000 others, the tendency is not to measure the individual consumption. One man wants to travel 1,000 miles, another 500. These are personal requirements. There is no sufficient reason why one should pay twice as much as the other because his need is twice as great. Such are the signs which appear even now in our individualist societies. Moreover, there is a tendency, though still a feeble one, to consider the needs of the individual, irrespective of his past or possible services to the community. We are beginning to think of society as a whole, each part of which is so intimately bound up with the others, that a service rendered to one is a service rendered to all. When you go into a public library, not indeed the National Library of Paris, but say into the British Museum or the Berlin Library, the librarian does not ask what services you have rendered to society before giving you the book, or the 50 books which you require. and he comes to your assistance if you do not know how to manage the catalog. By means of uniform credentials, and very often a contribution of work is preferred, the scientific society opens its museums, its gardens, its libraries, its laboratories, and its annual conversations to each of its members, whether he be a Darwin or a simple amateur. At St. Petersburg, if you are pursuing an invention, you go into a special laboratory or a workshop where you are given a place, a carpenter's bench, a turning lathe, all the necessary tools and scientific instruments, provided only you know how to use them, and you are allowed to work there as long as you please. There are the tools. Interest others in your idea. Join with fellow workers skilled in various crafts, or work alone if you prefer it. Invent a flying machine, or invent nothing. That is your own affair. You are pursuing an idea. That is enough. In the same way, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? They are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue. Thus, we find a tendency, eminently communistic, springing up on all sides, and in various guises, in the very heart of theoretically individualist societies. And we'll wrap today about 3/4 of the way down, page 163. Again, we are just beginning chapter 12, Peter Kropotkin, From the Conquest of Bread, 1892, all about anarchistic communism. And we will see you back mañana.